An equivalent ratio, they are ratios that have different numbers but represent the same proportion. Now, equivalent ratios can be formed by multiplying or dividing a ratio by the same number. Okay, so in this example, a baking recipe uses 1 cup of sugar for every 4 cups of flour. My first task is to express the relationship between sugar and flour as a ratio. So I'm going to let S represent sugar, and I'm going to let F represent flour. So for every 1 cup of sugar, I get 4 cups of flour. So my ratio is going to be 1 to 4. Okay, that's for part A. Now for part B, I'm asked how many cups of sugar would be required if the recipe had 16 cups of flour. So for that one, what I can do is this. Right below flour, I'm going to write 16 for 16 cups. And now here, I'm just going to draw a box. And to solve this, these are equivalent ratios. And I know they're equivalent because a baking recipe, it's going to be in proportion, right? Because you can't really change the recipe. If you have 1 cup of sugar for every 4 cups of flour, if you increase the cups of flours, you have to increase the cups of sugar in proportion to that. So in this case, I asked myself this, what can I multiply the number 4 by in order to let it become 16? And the answer to that would be 4, right? 4 times 4 is 16. And what I do to one side of the ratio, I have to do to the other one. So now I have to multiply 1 by 4. And 1 times 4 is going to be 4. So if I had 1 cup of sugar, I have 4 cups of flour. And if I have 16 cups of flour, I must now have 4 cups of sugar. Okay. Now, another thing to note, we can also express this answer as a fraction, like I said before, right? So 1 colon 4 can be written as 1 over 4. And if I do that, right, I basically have an equivalent fraction instead, where I have 16 on the bottom, and on the top, I have that box again, right? For equivalent fractions, what I multiply the bottom by, I also have to multiply the top by that same number. So 4 times 4 is 16, but because I multiply the bottom by 4, I multiply the top by 4, and 1 times 4 is 4. So these are the two ways you can visualize the question. I can either express it as a fraction, where I have 4 over 16, or express it as a ratio, where I have 4 to 16. But either way, I now find out my answer. 4 cups of sugar would be required for 16 cups of flour. Okay, now let's move on to non-equivalent ratios. So a non-equivalent ratio are ratios that have different numbers and does not represent the same proportion. So here's my example. Suppose a teacher who is 30 years old and a student is 10 years old. Write the ratio for the teacher to student. Okay, so let's do that first. Let's write the ratio for teacher to student. Since teacher came first, I'm going to let T represent teacher, and then I'm going to let S represent student. So teacher to student in a ratio. Now it says the teacher is 30 years old, okay, and the student is 10 years old. So that's going to be 30 to 10. Now the next question is, if the student is 5 years old, how old is the teacher? Okay, so if the student is 5 years old, how old is the teacher? Now you can already tell by the way the question is worded, this cannot be in proportion, right? Because if I were to assume that I can take 10 and divide it by 2 to get 5, I would do the same for the teacher, right? But then 10 divided by 2 is 5, but 30 divided by 2 is 15. This doesn't make any sense, right? If a student is 5 years old, that same teacher could not be 15 years old, right? In this case, what happens is if the student is 5 years old, you just subtract 5 from 10, and you would subtract 5 from 30, so the teacher would be 25 years old in theory. So this question wouldn't be a proportional question just based off of the wording. So because it's not in proportion, it's a non-equivalent ratio. So you can't just multiply or divide the ratio by the same number to get the same answer, right? So to be in proportion, if you are in proportion, you are allowed to multiply or divide a ratio by the same number. So notice here for this equivalent ratio, for this baking recipe question, I was able to multiply the ratio by the same number to get an equivalent ratio, but I can't do that for a non-equivalent ratio. I can't just divide 10 by 2 and 30 by 2 to get the same number. So how old is the teacher? The teacher is 25 years old.